With you all in Cork this evening, and just to follow on with what Helen had said there, yeah, my day job is to work for the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sports and the Media. I'm the commemorations unit, and we've been working on the Women's Strand now, and I've been working for the department since 2015. And I joined originally to be historical advisor, working on the commemoration of 2016, what became known as Team 16, and then. But I suppose the topic of my talk tonight is probably the looking at something that I'm working at outside of work. In that it's I'm currently working on a manuscript for O'Brien Press, who published a book that I did, No Ordinary Women, back in 2003, which has stayed in print ever since, and some of you may be familiar with it. And they asked me to look at a book on the period of the War of Independence. I wrote an article in 2018, I think, or 2019, maybe early 2019, called The Eyes and Ears, and I talked about women and involvement in the War of Independence, and talked about the level of espionage and the change really in how the material has been viewed. So for those of you who don't know me, I started to work in this area in the early 90s when I went to work in Kilmainham Jail, and I worked on the revamping or the building of the new museum in Kilmainham Jail, which opened in 1996. And in the lead up to that, one of the things that I ended up doing was I ended up researching the role of women, because I had studied women's history in university under Dr. Margaret McCurtain, and another great Corkonian, very proud Munster woman, as she described herself, and she obviously attended UCC as well. And so with her women's documents, of course, for the first time in university, I discovered that I was interested in sort of primary research, and it sort of made history come alive for me, because it's very difficult to write history on sort of sources that are already there. You have to be a really skilled writer in order to achieve a good writing. But the wonderful thing that has been women's history for the past 30 years is that it really is the history and the records and the archives that has been changing how we perceive and we view everything. So I really wanted to sort of look at that this evening, and I would encourage people to ask me questions. It's very hard, I think, sometimes when you're doing a talk to know people's level of history. But I usually assume when people come in and they tune in to a history lecture, and they tend to have themselves being pretty well read, so or have a family link or some involvement with this time that motivates them and interests them. But I want to read from the Mercier Press introduction to the book A Bridge at Bandon, that was published in 1972. And in the front of the book, it said that all books to date that have been published on the War of Independence have concentrated on purely the military aspect. This book is the first time to describe the active resistance of the people, a form of resistance that was later used by the French during the Second World War. And I think this is really important for what I'm really going to talk about tonight, which is, even though we have been discovering women's role in history and finding in every turn that their role was much more involved than we previously understood, and that is then to look at the sources and how they were written out. Some of you may be familiar with books like Dublin's Fighting Story, Told by the Men Who Made It, Kerry's Fighting Story, Limerick's Fighting Story, and again, even in the title, Told by the Men Who Made It, excluded really the role of women. But when the book by Kathleen Keyes MacDonald was produced in 1972, it was one of the few accounts of women, because at the time, I think for so many people, and you see this a lot even in the records and the letters of the women activists, there had been so much division in the period after the Civil War, that really it was simpler not to sort of talk politics for so many families. And we know that so many women married into sort of into families where they took the decision, particularly if they were on the other side in the Civil War, and not to speak about those times. When I used to visit people in the 90s, and that was one of the things that I did with Kilmainham Jail, we actually actively went out and sought out material. And when I was talking to people about their family's involvement, and at this stage, and I was very lucky to, be meeting very many of the people themselves who had participated, and certainly their children, and meeting their children at the end of their lives. I remember vividly that I spoke to Anna McBride White, who would be Maud Gonne's granddaughter, Sean McBride's daughter. She was the daughter of Kid Bulfin, who had been arrested in Kilmainham in 1923. Her brother, her kid's brother, his wife Nora Brick had been in prison at the same time. So all of a sudden, everybody was interconnected and all involved in this period in time. But Anna told me that in order to understand the history, that she had to pick it out. She wasn't taught it in school. You'll remember that it wasn't taught in school. And so she had to herself try and figure out and piece through the story to make sense of her very important family, who are sort of central to everything. And if you think about even now, Maud Gonne is mentioned, in schools today because of the association with the poetry of Yeats, if they don't even cover the history books, and opt for history. And then I'm also going to talk about the looking at Margaret Buckley as a Cork woman and her role in the War of Independence. And again, I'm going to look back at what I wrote about Margaret Buckley in 2003 and where the possibilities for looking into source material after that. And then I'm going to talk about the reprisals for the ordinary people, including the non-combatants. And I'm going to use an example of Melan in County Cork. And then I'm going to talk about another case study. So I'm going to make the end of the talk about a Bandon case study looking at Kathleen Keyes MacDonald's story, and then contrast it with one of the new women that I've discovered, and hopefully piece together while I'm talking to you something of why it's sort of new material and new source material. So I wanted to start in the very beginning where, sorry, wrong place to start. I wanted to start really with the the sort of the obvious place to start. And I years ago I spent a lot of time maybe avoiding the principal women because I was so interested in the rank and file. But I've discovered really over the years that it's so important to illustrate and remember the sort of the central point, and the reason that Countess Markovich, or Countess de Markovich, which is her correct title, she later became Madame Markovich when she was a TD, but up until sort of 1819, she was using her full name. And we know this from the material culture that survived, including a bag that was given to her, which has the initials CDM, all her paintings, and including her election literature in 1918. So it's only later on that she drops that and just becomes Markovich. And I can see very on my screen there, for any of you can spot that there's a typo there with Markovich. If this was a school now, the pupils will be pointing it out to the teacher. So I wanted to talk really here about when the Countess was released from prison. This is her receiving the freedom of Kilkenny after she's released from prison. And it isn't long before she's rearrested and ends up in prison in Cork. I thought there was a lovely quote from one of her letters: "The people of Cork spoiled me dreadfully, such fruits and flowers all the time." And she said that her stay in Cork jail was one of the most the easiest of her imprisonments, if that could be described. But I think it's really important for people to remember that she entered active politics at the age of 40 when she joined Inini na hÉireann, the Daughters of Ireland. And then 10 years later, she's elected in 1918 at the age of 50. And then she only survives for another 9 years, and she has 5 imprisonments. And you can see the change in her over the years. And that was why I illustrated here with the 2 photographs with her with sort of the space of 3-4 years. And this is down to her imprisonment. Now she's elected and she ends up as the TD Minister for Labour in the underground government. And I think sometimes we underestimate what that actually meant in terms of the idea that there's been a reevaluation of her as an individual in the sort of the canon by Margaret Ward has written about her role as a Minister for Labour and her in how she endeavoured to set up arbitration courts, to do surveys of wages, and set up unions, transferring them to Ireland so that they would have Irish bank accounts, and so that they could actually operate out of here independently. And I'm only using those three examples to talk about the level of which the people worked. And so when we're trying to talk about an underground government, part of a prescribed organization, the fact that people were constantly on the run, the fact that they had to hold cabinet meetings in private houses, and how they were running an office. And so the office that she used was set up like a commercial traveler's office, and then it also had a music school attached, so people would come in and out with musical instruments, and this was their way of concealing documents going in and out of the buildings. And when we think about setting up a whole infrastructure, a whole network of bank accounts, they got people to pay rates, they took over local and local government, they set up courts, they had their own police force, so they really dismantled the British civil apparatus in Ireland to such a great extent. So it wasn't just the military role that was happening, it was also the what was happening on a sort of a breaking down of the structures, and the Countess, if I can call her that, was sort of central to that. And again, I think that a lot of the accounts that have been told of her, early biographies, and the way that she was reported in the newspaper, sort of damaged her reputation. And for those of you who think that you know the story of the Countess, I would just urge you to go back and look at one of the more modern biographies and sort of and rediscover her in the capacity of the idea of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, which is that this is a very sophisticated and elaborate organization. And so I've just put the arrows here sort of to talk about the in 1920. I love this photograph because it's women talking to women, and I think that in itself is so was so unusual at the time. I mean, you think about there are photographs of the Ulster Unionist women, and they were a bigger organization, certainly in the period in 1912. So it's very important to remember that. So on the island of Ireland, we have another group of women rallying with their women's declaration, but they didn't, because just the nature of how the conflict changed, they didn't have the same role. So as Southern women did, and obviously they had to sort of become a women's army. But how much did they become a women's army? And that's part of what I'm going to look at in the talk this evening. And so this is Mabel Fitzgerald, who would be the mother of Garrett Fitzgerald, who eventually ended up on the opposite side of she stayed Republican when her husband was an Irish Free State minister and sheltered men on the run. It's really important also to remember how much of these women were very single-minded, they were independent, they were educated, and that actually is the way in which that the detractors ridiculed them in later years. And then we've got Mary McSweeney, proud Cork woman here. We've got Nanny O'Rahilly here in the foreground, and behind her are the two O'Rahileys. I'm trying to remember who this is now. I'll come back to me in a minute. And then Mrs. Pearce, Countess, Kathleen Clark, Anya Kant, Nancy Wise Power. This is her mother, and then this is I should remember that too. Sorry, I should have labeled them as well. I was being very optimistic that my memory would be better than it is. I'm gonna if they come back to me in a second, I'll go back to it. Sorry, with the darkness here, I'm not sure I can find my notes. And so one of the other side of it is so in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, you do have still members of the Irish Citizen Army, and you have members of Cumann na mBan. We know that the Cumann na mBan organization had previously split between those who had supported the First World War and those who had remained behind to remain as the organization that would support if Ireland was invaded. Then we have the 1916 Rising, and we have a figure now of 300 women who took part in that. That's documented women that we were able to identify through some photograph or historic document that proves their involvement. So again, if there are people whose family members say that they were involved in terms of the Rising, for example, and they aren't documented in the list that we prepared for 2016. It's that again, it's the difference between, I suppose, the official record and the idea that the oral history is so important and has been key to the way that we've rolled out the commemoration, the work that have been done by libraries and archives, to document, to digitize the family papers, that these are the ways in which we change the record and how we change the way in which we see history. So the one of the people that I always enjoyed reading, and I would urge you that if you wanted to read a first-hand account, so if there's for some reason you or maybe you're teaching a class, or if there was something that you wanted to sort of dip your toe in. And I remember when I was traveling on the bus Éireann buses in 2016, and I was on a trip to Derry, and I sat beside a woman, and Mary Parlov was looking out at us because they profiled women and they had decorated a bus, and in a tiny way I had a small part in that the rollout of that. And anyway, so they were using the wonderful series of illustrations that the Royal Irish Academy had done and Mary Parlov was there, and I didn't give the lady a lecture. I just said that she's a really interesting character, and if you can access it, and I know I spelled out and she used to spell out her name all the time as well, and I said, you should go and look at her witness statement, and it's just so lively, it's so well written, in that she gives this sort of almost breathless interview to the Bureau of Military History. So as you know, that was you could go in voluntarily. They put advertisements in the paper and they encourage people to go and give their statements. Now, there was an assessment by the military in terms of whether or not people were honest, or what their perception of them was. So there wasn't notations taken, but they didn't interfere with what they said. And so these are very much oral history accounts, and some of them just tell you a lot more about characters, and some of them are can be quite critical of other members in the movement, because these were going to be sealed during the lifetime, so it wasn't like a little bit of gossip. But Mary Parlov sort of sits down, and the first thing she says is, I'm 71 or 72, and then off she goes in this role, talking about her experiences and how that she liked to live life on the run, and at the time she lived with several family members. Nobody was working, and they lived on tea and bread, and she that was how she lived her life. So she's very interested. But she says here that she was educated by the Presentation nuns, and she makes the reference that that a Sister Bonaventure especially made a rebel of me. So I don't know if the Presentation convent have records that you could identify this Sister Bonaventure, but this is the way in which, if somebody writes an essay, or somebody does an exploration, this is the way that we layer history that really, really makes it interesting and full. And so on the screen there, you have the picture of the group of the Irish Citizen Army sitting out outside Liberty Hall. And this is one of the few photographs of her. So I've literally just pulled it from a high resolution of this particular photograph of her sitting here in the front. And again, the idea is that it's her based on her description. And so the thing with it is that, and then she's sitting next to Helena Maloney, and this is Winnie Carney. You can see my cursor moving across the screen there. And then Kathleen Lynn is sitting here as well in this sort of front row of the most famous of the Irish Citizen Army members. And they're sitting outside in 1917 outside the destroyed Liberty Hall. So I'm going to move on because I'm running a little bit slowly through this. Sorry about that. This is Margaret Buckley, who went on to become president of Sinn Fein after Mary McSweeney, and she was very famous for the Doyle Bonds case, where that went to court, and there was a tussle over money that had been left behind over who was entitled to it, but what's interesting about Margaret Buckley is that I was familiar with her from the book The Jangle of the Keys, which I actually got in the early 90s in a book sale for £10, and it's a very rare book. I didn't realize it at the time, and It just in the front of it has with compliments of the author, but she didn't sign her name. And it's her account of her imprisonment in the Civil War. What's really important about the way in which I wrote this in 2003, I just amended it very slightly, but I just to add in, so I didn't even put her surname, Margaret Goulding. So she married Patrick Buckley in 1906 when she was 26. He was described as a typical rugby playing British civil servant. He died young, and Margaret was left well off by her husband. She moved to Margarita Road, Glasnevin, Dublin. So what's important about this is that her husband was a member of the RIC. And what's particularly interesting about so many of the women who are familiar, like Bridie O'Mullane, if people are familiar with names from this time, her father was in the RIC. And I'm going to reference that in a little while in relation to another story. But what it is that the way that the stories were written, that the things that were glossed over, the things that were left out. And then I was just reading and preparing for this this talk, and I realized that during the War of Independence, she returns to County Cork to nurse her father who's ill. And so when I wrote that at the time, I didn't take in anything about what she would be doing in Cork at that time. But I had that she was in the circles of the McSweeney's and the McCurtains. And so here, this is the indication that maybe her father wasn't ill and that she just leaves Dublin during this critical period. And she would have been well known everywhere as being a widow of an RIC man. And that in some ways would have protected her from sort of detection. And I think what's important about it is to, sorry, I've just clicked on there quickly, is that we know she goes back and she becomes a judge in the Sinn Féin courts, but she doesn't get detected at this particular period of time. And I always say in relation to the espionage and in relation to this period, it's really important to remember that was the principal thing that everybody was trying to do, was to avoid detection, to avoid getting identified in relation to this, because they were trying to avoid being recorded in the RIC reports, trying to avoid being recorded even in their workplace. But these are the places where we find the accounts now. And obviously there were 50 women, and according to their own accounts, 50 women arrested during the War of Independence, which is tiny when you think about the 700 plus that were arrested during the Civil War, because of course the organization knew who had been the eyes and ears during the earlier period. And so the other person that I sort of wanted to talk about in terms of of being a sort of a famous Corkonian, partly because this week is the marking of the curfew murders, or just beyond it. And I think it's really important to talk again about somebody who's so well known, who became a TD both in the second and third Dáils, obviously remained Republican, then ended up a member of the continuing second Dáil, that continued to meet right into the 1920s, which was known as the Miss McSweeney's Dáil. But I don't want to go too far into that story tonight, but I will answer any questions on it. But what's important for me to sort of talk about here is that when I was researching her, and she lived where I grew up in Limerick, and so I've always had an interest in her. And she founded the Féile Lumni, which was very popular with our school for, you know, reciting poetry, public speaking, singing, drama, and putting on plays. So I always put my love of this public speaking down to Kate O'Callaghan, her sisters, and the other women that established it in the 1950s. And so what's important about Kate O'Callaghan is that she was a highly educated woman. She came to Limerick after she had completed her teaching degree, to take over in 1909 her older sister Moira's position, when she had married a Derry O'Donovan, who was also from Cork, and he was living in Limerick as a butter importer, or working. He had trained in Denmark, and so obviously Limerick being a commercial centre, so they had moved there. And then Moira had become the first lay teacher in Mary Immaculate College, and when she was leaving her post, her sister took over. And then when her sister married Michael O'Callaghan they had a massive tannery in the city, then a younger sister Eilish Elizabeth or Eilish took over, and she remained unmarried and retained her position until she retired. So the Murphys had been in Mary Immaculate College in the training college from the earliest years, from 1909 right up until the 1950s, which is incredible. So their contribution again isn't maybe as well known even within the college, but the terribly upsetting thing is that that the papers of those sisters did not survive. And a few of their Irish books ended up in the Mary Immaculate collection. There was a sale of some of the contents of the house, and I met a woman who had the same name as Kate O'Callaghan, and she was went in. She's an architect in Limerick, and she picked up a few paintings and a few prints that were there because it was the sale. Somebody had said to her, "They're selling the contents of Kate O'Callaghan, your namesake's home," and that's why she picked them up. And she gave me a copy of a book that was from the collection. It was George Bernard Shaw's An Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism. But the reason that I was given it at the Kate O'Brien weekend was because I was talking on Lady Lavery, which was the subject of my thesis at university, and I published a book on Lady Lavery when I was in my 20s, in 1996, and I think I was speaking there in 1999 or something. But that she gave it to me because this is a book that Lady Lavery is mentioned in as a thank you in the foreword, but now it's more significant to me because it actually belonged to Kate O'Callaghan. And obviously she publicized her husband's murder by producing this pamphlet, which is particularly rare. This is one that's in the Limerick Museum, and it's the case of Michael O'Callaghan. So she went public with her story and ended up in public life. But at the same time, the involvement of Kate and her sisters and all of the sort of detail of what happened next. And obviously she was under threat. She was also subjected to all the raids that we know so many of the other women were. And obviously her husband had taken a public position as Lord Mayor of Limerick, and eventually was killed by Crown forces or unknown assailants, but they were it was targeted by the Crown forces. But what's really important again is to see the comparison of obviously with Cork, with the Lord Mayor of Cork, McCurtain, and obviously I'm going to just talk briefly then about the McSweeney's. But what I really wanted to say in relation to this story is that in terms of her being a Murphy from Crossmahon. And when I went to the Kilmurray Museum, where they have this wonderful costume, her Celtic revival dress that was donated by the Murphy family there, it was an understanding of this family of 10. And so many of the sisters went on to third level education, and they were so active in so many ways. And another sister, much younger sister, I think she was about 10 years younger, Elsie, ended up imprisoned in Kilmainham in the Civil War, and she was a doctor, and she looked after a lot of the patients there. But it was many years before I discovered that Elsie Murphy was also her sister. And then of course we've got this wonderful image of Mary McSweeney speaking to a massive crowd here. It's in from UCD archives and from the McSweeney papers. And I think that the cult and the sort of the way in which they promoted the story and articulated the story of Ireland, not only the story of the McSweeney family, but this is really, it's not a very good reproduction. It's from Cork Museum. But why I wanted to illustrate this, particularly in this talk, was that it's the identification of the women in these photographs. Some ways we've passed the 100 years now, and maybe this should have been done 50 years ago. But it's really important to connect the keys and make the references to identify these women, because as you can see, even though I'm very familiar with them, is that if I don't myself have this reference point, it's it's the who's who of the time, and the importance of the collections and who they're associated with. So I wanted to just refer back before I will move on to the next stage, and I'm sorry I'm probably running too slowly here, so maybe I won't read all of this out now. If Helen can give me a sort of a signal, and when if I'm running over. But I'm basically this is Countess Markovich's speech to the convention in October of 1921. So the previous one was 1920, now we're in 21. And she said, I'm proud of the girls who stood in the gap of danger during the times of stress and war last winter. There was a generous chorus of praise from all parts of Ireland for the girls of Cumann on the way they have worked through the winter. Their courage, their capacity, and above all, their discretion were praised to me. These girls did daring and brave things that nobody ever heard of from anyone. The capacity too, and the training as well as the discretion, and the courage of those who are under fire all deserve great praise. When the history of Ireland is written, the name of Cumann, when the name of Cumann will go down to your children and your children's children as an organization will stand as a memorial to the Irish people of the great organization of the past. So we know that that was not really the case, and it really wasn't documented. If it wasn't for the release of the pension records, which actually have shown us the magnitude and the importance of these women, I'm so grateful to be still working in the field, to be able to go through the pension records and actually discover how much more the women did, how much we can add to the story, and we can, and I often say that because I documented the women who were in Kilmainham jail by their names in the autograph books, and I met a lot of the families during my early career, that it's like meeting old friends. It's like, it's incredible. But the stories in the pension record are really tragic, and it tells a lot about poverty, deprivation, illness, and mental health issues, because most of the people were looking for supports to meet medical bills, to supplement their income. They weren't the wealthiest of people. They weren't people who had got through that period and didn't need that state support. So it is a very, very difficult archive to go through. And I understand that if anybody has family that it's personal to them, it would even be more difficult than a historian who's standing outside and doesn't have a full understanding maybe of the story. So how on earth are we as women's historians still talking about people disappearing? And I wanted to show you a series of photographs in order to illustrate something that as an understanding of what happened. So when the National Library last year, sorry, it would be the year before now, and or could be early 2020, but anyway, they had an exhibition in the photographic archive to do with the period of the War of Independence, and they were showing Pathé footage on a reel. And I was standing there, and there's a piece of footage that relate to this woman. So it's in March of 1920, and there's a massive crowd outside Mountjoy Jail where Sinn Fein members are on hunger strike because they are not treated as political prisoners. And a woman comes out of the crowd, and she stands up on this rock, and she starts to speak to the crowd. And in the footage, you don't know what she's saying, but you're saying this is primarily a male crowd. This is a woman who's got status, who's got importance, who doesn't seem fearful of what she's doing. And yet we don't know who she is. So I posted it on Twitter, and I put a call out, and Sean Gannon, who's a librarian in Limerick, who has done a fantastic essay on the curfew murders. I worked with him on that, and that's now on the Limerick City site. But what I would say is that he came back and he said that he thought so this woman is Miss Cotter. Alba Rogers, who's done a lot of work in Louth and is working on her PhD on Cumann, and a great historian. She also came back, and she did a quick survey of the census record and said that she looked for a Miss Cotter who would be approximately the right age at this stage, and was Catholic, and came up with 18 people it could be. But Sean sort of narrowed it down, and he said it's possibly this Miss Cotter, Elizabeth Jane, Crotty, I'm calling her Cotter, Crotty, who was actually arrested along with Bridie O'Malan in Sligo. And I spent the 3 months of my life trying to track this woman down and find her story. I even went as far as to publish the story in the Sligo Champion in order that I could possibly turn up somebody who would know what happened to them. And a local historian contacted me and said that she made inquiries, and she found 2 old ladies who had been taught shorthand by her sister. And I tracked down where she's buried. She's buried with her mother and her brother in the Sligo cemetery. But the family didn't have any descendants. They all remained unmarried, and she died young. This woman who was out canvassing with Bridie O'Mullane, she died in her 40s, and strangely, I was in two places during the lockdown. I was at home in Ballina, and I was also attending a regular medical appointment on the Mall in Sligo as I searched for this woman. And it turned out that I walked every Thursday past the place that she died. And when I found out that I discovered that her father had been in the RAC, she'd always lived in Sligo except for one place. She had lived for a very brief period in Ballina in County Mayo, where I live. And she had her will probated at the courthouse. So I often think that I was close, and yet so close, and yet so far, because 100 years had passed. So I still don't know if this is the same lady. But what we know now is that she's reciting the Rosary in Irish from another account in the newspaper. So she's not giving a speech. But you can see here that when it's documented in a book, it says British forces confront Irish Republican rally in Dublin in 1920. So again, it's slightly misleading to what she is doing. And so again, it's like how we use the material and how we understand it. And then this is a snapshot of the section in which the newspaper, which was the Manchester Guardian, I think, 20,000 people demonstrating at the Mountjoy prison. And there were tanks and armored cars. As you can see in the wonderful Getty image here, you can see the tank. But what's really important to illustrate here is that it isn't an easy thing to do, to walk into a crowd that's in the middle of something as tense, with armed guards and a tank and a huge crowd. So this woman knew that if she would stand up at the front of the crowd and she could pacify the situation by the reciting of the rosary, she had command of a situation. And so therefore, I would say that she was central and really important to the organization, but I can't prove it. And as a historian, I have to really, really stop myself from surmising, but I think it indicates to you why it's so important that we have the documentary evidence and that we question and re-question what we've been told. And so as we move on in time, so the next convention talked about most difficult and at the same time, its balance is the most satisfactory year, which the organization passed through its inception. And then it talks about how so tense and how difficult it was. I don't need to tell people of Cork. And I had a lovely conversation with Helen in the preparation for this in this talk, and she very kindly sent me a PDF of the book that she has written on the library that was destroyed, the beautiful Carnegie Library that was destroyed in the night of in December, well, the two nights, 11th and 12th of December, when Cork was, and the commercial heart of Cork was destroyed. And I think what's really important there is that, again, a little bit like I've just described, the idea that the ladies' reading room would have had the journals and the meeting of women like Mary McSweeney when she was involved in the women's franchise movement, and the movement and the sense that if you've known somebody from before, you still interconnect with them as the years have passed. And so much of this unwritten history, this interchange, this communication, and in the way that the Cork Library would have been a hub of activity of people, and there were so many of them who were interested in language and education, that I think that it's in the same way that Maud Gonne used to meet with James Connolly and others in the National Library, and I used to think of that as I walked up and down those stairs. And so I think what's important to remember that while we talk about what the women did, a lot of the time in Cumann na mBan, we talk about, they were involved in drill practice and they were doing first aid, and they weren't carrying rifles and they weren't in the firing line, and they were at these ambushes in order to assist. But now we have to reread it with the pension record and talk about the carrying of weapons between places, the carrying of dispatches, and most importantly, this espionage and this collecting of information. And when I was collecting my material for the period for in Kilmainham jail, I met one of the women who told me that she had been intelligence gathering But sadly, I didn't have the knowledge or the questioning, the proper questioning, in order to ask her about what she had done. And what I think now, reflecting on it past the years, is that she was 19 and 20 when she did her work in Common Amon, collecting guns and doing the espionage that she did. And I thought, like, sitting there when I was 27, 28, thinking that I was young, but I was young as much intellectually as I was and I wasn't young really in terms of age. But I think what's important is that she told me what she did when I was that age, knowing that she was giving me documentation, and she handed me a photograph of the auxiliary that she used to meet and get information from, and because he was fond of her. And that's how I wrote that in Guns and Chiffon. It was almost dismissive of what she did, but when you look at her pension record, she describes things like she was a cloak. She doesn't actually spell out in her pension record what she was doing in terms of espionage, because it wasn't going to gain her anything more in terms of her record. And that's really what we're really discovering here, that it would be penalized. So when we look at the raids that were happening, this is a photograph by Hogan that was used in the American Commission. So in America, they started an organization called the American Commission for the Conditions in Ireland, and they gathered 100, well, they wanted originally 100 prominent Americans that would actually hold hearings in Washington to look into the situation. And they ended up with 150. Then they voted five commissioners, and then they had hearings in Washington. They sent over a group, mostly of the members of that group who were members of the Society of Friends, and it was led by a man by the name of Mr. France, and they went through Ireland. And so the photograph I showed you previously, that's in Kilmainham Jail's collection, of Charlotte Despard and Maud Gon McBride, they were actually in Cork as part of that investigation. And then the other photograph that's included is this young girl who's noted in the press as Miss Brown. She's one of the three daughters of a widow, and this is all the contents of the house taken out before the house is destroyed. As we know, that when there were official reprisals later, they tended to burn, but in this particular period, in the sort of unofficial, they destroyed, and this is absolutely, as you can see, the knocking of this shed in order to make it unusable. So this widow who's running a farm, has no house and it becomes homeless. And so when they had the publications, they decided on the back of that to set up the American Committee for Relief in Ireland. And this is the cover of the book, which was called A Summon to Serve. And this in March of 1921, the centenary of this month here, is when they started on St. Patrick's Day, tomorrow, 100 years ago, a drive to raise money to rebuild these homes. And they raised, in one account, it said $5 million in order and they were giving out to people the story of the rebuilding. But what's really interesting about the story of the White Cross is that a lot of the families that were helped, those stories weren't really recorded in the same way. There's one body of material in the Kilkenny and Roath House, and I've had opportunity to look at it. But what I think is important for anybody listening, if there is a familial story or some reference to the aid from the White Cross, that would really be important in documenting how this worked. But this organization and this lobby by Irish America was so hugely important for the propaganda purposes and for the highlighting of what was happening in Ireland, what was happening in a British colony as a sort of domestic problem that ultimately brought the attention of the world to it. And I suppose you can say it hastened the treaty. And so for the final, I don't know how much I have, a few minutes left. For the last of my talk, and I do want to have some time for questions if there are any, is just to talk then about the Bandon case. So what I've done when I've spoken to other groups in other libraries is I've tried to make it as local as possible, and I hope that I've done justice to Cork. It's such a huge county and there was so many activities. I suppose it's only just to give you a flavour within a very short space of time. So one of the things that we know with this is the photograph that is of Kathleen Keyes MacDonald, who lived in outside Bandon in a house called Castle Lack, which is a substantial house. She had a governess and she had a cook and she had a maid, and they were well to do of the time. Her family had been millers. She was a Healy, and her brother still ran the mill that was in their family name, which was and then in terms of the other family, the McDonald's, they had a house in South Main Street in Bandon, and then their family home, there was a mill attached to this house. And Richard, who was William's father, was a Redmondite, and while he was still alive, he was a magistrate. The house was protected and they weren't raided, even though William had been the first to set up a volunteer movement, and Kathleen had set up Cumann na Món shortly after it was established with a homemade sign. And she says that 300 women came and joined Cumann na Món, but there was a little bit of a sort of a tussle in Bandon at the time, because this is pre the split for Redmond. Some women joined a Red Cross that was set up by Lady Bandon, so she was called down to the convent. This is all in her book, to see the nun in the convent, to find out what she was doing, and the pressure that was put on her to not follow through with Cumann na Món. So she was very public, and they had a rifle range and they drilled at the house. So as you can imagine, when it came time for the period of the War of Independence, they were targeted. And if I had more time, I was going to read from you the account of, one of those raids at the house. And it's really quite harrowing, because what's really important to remember is that she said that she was taken out in her nightdress, and she was put out onto the lawn while they ransacked the house, and she got a terrible chill, and she ended up having kidney problems from then on. And she, so much so that when in her pension account, she details her medical history, and eventually she had to have a kidney removed in Cork City, and her doctor gives a letter to say that this is a direct result of her time in her what she had been subjected to. What's interesting about the photograph that you see here, it's sort of unusual in that you can sort of see the Germanic references. Well, they had actually spent their honeymoon in Upper Bavaria in 1913, and that's why this photograph is having them dressed in this particular way. So they were very well traveled. So when her husband ends up arrested after the 1916 rising, she ends up, and she was arrested herself briefly, because they were identified again as people who had a car and been associated with the McSweeney's and the McCurtains. And so she ends up following him to London and requesting permission to see him in prison in England, and probably because of their connections, because they managed to send letters in the right directions. He doesn't get transferred to Frongach and gets back to Bandon, and then they end up. Sorry, excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat now, so I'm going to have to stop just for a second. And then her husband leaves again when there's a price on his head, and spends time in London, and this affects his pension record later on. So I think what's interesting is, again, in terms of the children aren't identified, but she's again a young mother during this period in time. And when she talks about the raids, she talks about the children being in the house, in the nursery, and how frightening it was when men would just come and through the house and ransack it. We know that one of her sons, who later went on to suffer from TB, was born in 1923. So the children are all born in this period, and all small and very young during this period in time. But I think what's interesting about her story is that she's not documenting beyond the women that were active, and we do have the women of Cumann na Món, and she doesn't stay in Cumann na Món after 2018, and you can see clearly from her pension record it's also to do with her ill health. But again, in the book, it's very hard to document it in a particular way in relation to her personal story, because in 1972 there wasn't the the same probing that went on. And I spoke to Mary, who runs Mercier Press now, and she actually it was the first book that she worked on. And she talked about bringing her to being interviewed in RTE, but not anything of the sort of the probing conversations that maybe somebody would have with somebody today. There wasn't that sort of way of being with somebody. But it was sort of interesting to think of the span of time. I was asking the question where the originals of those photographs are. So if anybody out there knows if there's where this archive is, that would be really helpful. And so I'm going to finish with the story of the Anna McQueen. So I gave a talk in Limerick a number of years ago, and I would always ask that people would record the stories, as I have done tonight. It's sort of something I've always done. And this lady called Mrs. McGuire contacted me, and she told me that she had nursed her mother-in-law, Joanna, but known as Anna McQueen, in old age, and she had told her a lot of her activities. But as she said herself, that she had small children, she was busy working, mum, and she was looking after her mother-in-law who was in ill health, and she just didn't have the time to sit and listen to those stories. And so when I spoke about it, she felt that she wanted, because now she herself was in her late 80s, and she felt that it was important, the stories. So in the early part of this, when we were in level 3, I was able to go and see her. It was at level 3, but I got to see her, and I talked to her again about the story, because I'd met her a number of years before, and I followed up again. And so Anna was somebody who could drive, and what we've pieced together from the story and from the record that's in the pension record, and what is in the family memory and the family lore, and then trying to piece it together, was that Anna's family, she'd suffered a lot of tragedy. A number of her family members had died. Her parents were dead by the time she was in her late teens. And so she was working, I think, as a domestic in a townland called Galway in County Limerick. Now, her daughter-in-law thought that she worked in Galway, but I think that I've identified her in the census record in Galway. Trying to place her and trying to find out how she became friendly with the Crowley family in Bandon has proved difficult. But we know that she was summoned to come down to Cork by the number 3 Brigade, and she was sent to Bandon to take up a job, to work in a tobacconist in the town that was frequented by members of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries. And that's where she was sent to work. But because she didn't have any experience in as a shop assistant, it was really, really difficult to get a position. Her brother-in-law, whose family, who had shops, wrote her application, and so she was able to go. And so while the family knew that she'd gone to Bandon to take up this position, they didn't know that she had gone up to take up this position to go undercover for the IRA. She was described by Con Crowley in her account as one of the most trusted girls in the Bandon area. And this is one of the things I should always point out, is that, and some people may know this, is like people were known really as girls before they married. And so it's often used about women, and when you do the calculation on their age and you find that they're in their early 30s, it doesn't sit well with you, but that's the case. And so she didn't actually, Anne had never achieved a full pension. And the reason she didn't receive a full pension was because she was sent down to the IRA. She was told not to join the local Cumann. She worked with the local Cumann, giving them what she had, her espionage and her intelligence reports, but she was basically instigating and collecting them. And so when it came time for her pension to be approved, she didn't get awarded a full pension, and she was furious, because she said that she did more than people that she'd known who got the full pension. But we know why she didn't get the pension is because Cumann said that she wasn't involved with them. She had to get the pension being under Cumann, because working directly to the IRA wasn't actually recognized within the pension structure. And so then it's queried by the Metropolitan authorities, and she basically ends up being an application that goes on for years. She even made a representation to Eamon de Valera when he came to Limerick in 1943, asking him to reopen her pension because of what she had done. And you can see again how the letters passed through the record in order that the verification came from members of the IRA. Surviving officers of the unit will bear out all my statements. She said that they were conversant with the hazardous nature of her duties. Sean Buckley, who's mentioned in many of the accounts, including the Bridget Vanden is mentioned, and the members of Common Amon that are all mentioned in the Keys MacDonald book are also mentioned here. So 4 years her claim wasn't processed. And then she said that she prepared her statement too hurriedly, and she hadn't given a true impression what I suffered mentally, physically, socially, and personally. In her appeal, she writes she wants some kind of fair play, and she's evident, and she names women who she said, you know, have got the full record and that she hasn't. And according to her, that she was working at intelligence work all the time. I was in touch with them, and she said never did she get arms or ammunition from the enemy like I did. She was claiming for 7 years and seeking a D class for the nature of her worth. She was awarded just 2.5 years and an E class for what she described as the critical dates, and she saw it as a grave injustice, and there was no question in the rank that she held. And so what I would say is that what I would like you to take away from the talk this evening really is this understanding that history is ever evolving, and that what we do and what we understand now is that there was truly a sort of a big and a contribution that was substantial to the women that took part in the War of Independence. And some of the material that has been there and some of the people have been in, as they describe, living in plain sight. But even though I would consider maybe that I had a degree of expertise in this area, I'm always humbled when you find original documentation that tells a different story. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. That was just fascinating. There's just a question here from Mura Nigonal. She says, Sinead, would all members of Common Amon who were imprisoned during the Civil War have received a pension? If so, where would I access this? My grand aunt was imprisoned twice during that period.
Okay, right. So thank you very much for your question. Okay, there's two things there. There were a lot of women who didn't apply for the pension. And so the only thing I would say to you is that they're still releasing pension material. It's not complete yet. So we don't know who's still there to be released, okay? It's completely egalitarian. So even though I work in the department and you don't get any more access to that information. So there's still a possibility that she's there. The other thing I would say to you is that if you've already searched the pension record and you haven't found her, put in her Christian name, like put in Kathleen or Mary or whatever the name is, and then systematically go through the list. And even if there were, because I didn't know if Kathleen had a pension, and I put in Keys, I put in MacDonald, and I didn't turn it up. And then I put in Kathleen and didn't write anything else. And then I scrolled down and I found her. So just to say to you that if you've searched and you can't find her, just go back again and she may be there. The other thing is that if you want to send through Helen your details, and I can see whether or not I have any little bits of information, because when I put together the list for Kilmainham, I standardized the referencing, or the publisher standardized the referencing, and I actually have my own handwritten notes from the original time, so they might be in relation to some of the autograph books or something that might give you a lead. And when Kilmainham is back open again, that's a fabulous collection, and there also are lists and various things if she was in prison that you can look at for her referencing. But the pension, no, I think that a lot of people opted not to do it if they had any sort of means, because it was a very difficult process. As you could see here, it went on for years. they had a lot of negative things that happened. You had to give a lot of personal information, and it wasn't simply a case of submitting just your record. You had to go then and get all these people to verify. It was quite a difficult process. So I would say that if she didn't feel that she wanted to revisit any of that material, or she had any difficulty in relation to the state, for many of the time people didn't want to do that. And a lot of people said things like, you know, I did it for Ireland, I didn't do it for compensation, I didn't do it for any sort of recognition. So they never went for pension, and they never went for the pension, and they never went for medals.
Great. There's just a few comments from people thanking you, Sinead, for a fascinating talk and remarking on the amount of espionage carried out by so many women that we knew nothing about until recently, really.
Yeah, and I think it all ties into the work that's been done, you know, by Linda Connolly and by, you know, Mary McAuliffe and Liz Gillis. And I mean, it's a very rich field. I mean, when I was doing my research back in the 90s, you know, there was very little, there was very few people working on it. Margaret Ward had done work, and people like I'm trying to think, the 1916 book, and Helena Wagon had done one on Winifred Carney, and Ruth Talon. That's who I was trying to think of. So she did the 1916 book. So I think what's interesting now is that there's an awful lot of families who are actually doing family research, and they're doing a lot of, you know, referencing, and as I said, you can see the richness that happens when you have somebody talking to you, almost talking you through those pension records. So if there's somebody out there who's looking at a pension record and they want me to sort of read it with them, I'd be happy to do that as well. You know, I mean, sometimes you can see things because you've looked at so many of them that somebody else mightn't see.
There's just one more, Sinead, and I suppose we leave it at that then. It's
okay.
From Niall Murray, and he says, in recent weeks, researching intelligence and other services in Macroom, I've noted an increased role given to women from late 1920 and early 1921 as martial law was imposed in Cork. And she's wondering, or he's wondering, if your research elsewhere has shown a similar chronological trend in other urban areas.
Yeah, I'm probably not has done more sort of the hands-on research than I have. I think what I'm noticing is that when you look at the you know, that the when you're looking at an individual, the amount of things you can pull in to sort of make a connection. But certainly the one woman that I've done a good deal of research again with a family in Australia, is a woman by the name of Patricia Hoey. And the period that you're talking about is there's absolutely a huge increase in the raids in Dublin during that period, because then there seems to be an identification of those key women that were close in Collins' circle at that particular time. So that's the only thing that I would have come across. But certainly if there's anything particular that he'd like me to look out for, would he let me know? Because it's like your antenna is up, and when you sort of know what to look for.
Super. That was just fascinating, Sinead. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's grand. As I said, it was hard to contextualize it to. As I said, Cork is very intimidating as a topic because it was just so wide ranging. So yeah,
you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fabulous. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night, all. Thank you. Is there a? Oh, sorry. Sorry, there's one other. Are you gone?
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. No problem.
Yeah. Mary Parlov, is that how you pronounce it? It's featured in the Small Lives at Home in Cork in the Nano Nagle Centre.
Oh.
Sister
lovely.
Venture is also mentioned.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, I must look at that. Is that something I can see online?
Yes, that's in the Nano Nagle Centre in Cork. I would imagine it's online. I'll find out and let you know.
Yeah, that'd be lovely to see the link.
Yeah.
And just to say for people there that in terms of just to back to the work that I'm doing for the department in terms of the we hope at the end of the sort of the centenary to sort of do a map. And it's going to be hard because I mean, like somewhere like Cork is going to have such an amount of material But I suppose if there was any sense, Helen, that you could sort of maybe sort of take a vox pop over the next while and sort of ask people what they think is the single most important thing that happened during the decade of centenary related to women. Not an easy question, but
No.
what's the most standout thing or the most standout person? So if people could apply themselves to that question, that would be really interesting and helpful. And as I said, if anyone has to come forward, as I said, with digitization, you know that, Helen, now that it's so easy to take the photographs and copy them, and we don't even need to be in the offices for people to share that material with us if they're welcome, you know, if they would welcome the opportunity for us to be able to you know, share them, like as in the general public. I know sometimes it's hard if it's a personal, you know, photograph that's related to your family, but that's really where the wealth and richness has come from the decade of centenary for me, has been these photographs that people have of the key protagonists, and also this thing of the rank and file. They become real people.
Super. Okay, that's great. Thank you very, very much. And we'll put out a call for that from the fork. Yeah.
Okay, great. And as I said, we'll be in touch again. Thanks a million, Helen, and for everything. And good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good night, Sinead. Good night, everybody. Thank you.